to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Hi, welcome to an episode of Hotel Bar Sessions Special Edition. I'm Rick Lee, and unusually, I am not joined here in the bar by my co-hosts, Dr. Lee M. Johnson and Dr. Talia Mae Betcher, but I am alone because we decided that between seasons, rather than drop some what I call classic episodes, Lee calls them repeats, and frankly, I think Talia just calls them reruns, we would drop some new content. Each of us, separately, would reflect on some topic or issue or question that has come up in the podcast or come up in our lives, or that really just is sticking in our craw and is ripe for some philosophical investigation. I've decided that I'm going to talk about metaphysics. Now, for longtime listeners of the podcast, you will know that not only do I say that I do metaphysics, or I am a metaphysician, and that my co-hosts, going all the way back to the early days when I joined the podcast, laugh at me and criticize me for doing this. And maybe many of you don't even know what this thing is that I'm talking about or they're talking about, why they're making fun of me for doing it. So I thought I'd take some time just to talk about what I think metaphysics is, why I'm interested in it, and why I think it's important, if not old-fashioned. I kind of enjoy the fact that if you go to a bookstore, do people go to bookstores anymore? I have in mind Barnes & Noble, big bookstores like that. There would be next to the philosophy section, the very small philosophy section, a slightly larger section called Metaphysics. And there you could learn about communicating with spirits on other planets, how crystals work and what you can do with them, how to interrupt your energy flow and redirect it in more positive directions, how to unlock your chakras, and so on. That's not what we in the academic discipline of philosophy call metaphysics. I should start out by saying, until about the 1600s, philosophers just did philosophy. They didn't say, oh, this is a theory of knowledge, that is epistemology, or this is about being and acting well, that is ethics. This is the way to use power and the right way for the right ends, that is political philosophy. All of it was just philosophy. And I think that's for good reason, because we can't talk about what is, that's what metaphysics studies, without talking about how do we know it, whether that's how it ought to be or not, and so on. And so I think the philosophy of language, the philosophy of knowledge, ethics, political philosophy are not at all separable from metaphysics. So let me begin. What is this thing called metaphysics? We could put it in the most empty and probably least helpful way, and we could say that metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that studies being as such. Now, I say that that's probably least helpful because this term being is not just ambiguous, perhaps it's even meaningless. And then what does this as such mean, and so on. I like to come at it from a completely different direction. Some years ago on the David Letterman show, David and Paul Schaefer, his sidekick and band leader, used to have this recurring segment called Is It Something or Is It Nothing? What they would do on this segment is they would have someone come out. I remember one where a person comes out with a stainless steel bra on, with a metal grinder in each hand. She is on a unicycle and she's grinding away to music on this brazier. So sparks are flying and she's on the unicycle and music is playing. And the question is it something or is it nothing? Now, I think That is the basic question of metaphysics. Let's move away from David Letterman to an aspect of everyday life. So I'm walking down the street, I look up the street, I see my friend walking toward me, I get a stupid grin on my face, and as I get closer, I start to wave, and then all of a sudden I realize I have no idea who the hell this person is. It's not my friend. So here now, we have a clear experience of the way things appear to be being different from the way things are. This is a metaphysical kind of experience. That is, we recognize our way of attaching to the world through knowledge and acquaintance and our senses and seeing, hearing, tasting, and so on, that this doesn't always bring us information or the knowledge about what actually is the case. But notice, this doesn't freak us out. I don't melt down and have to go to a specialist to figure out the medicine I need to cope with the fact that sometimes what I see is not what is. Why is that the case? Why don't we have a meltdown at this point? It seems like we have some kind of insight, not just about what is, but also we have an insight about the fact that our ways of attaching to the world through knowledge or sensation, and maybe other ways, emotions, for example, do not always attach us to the world as it is, but there's a mismatch between the way the world is and the way that it is emerging for us in these various ways, knowledge, sensation, emotion, etc. So metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that tries to figure out whether we could have access to what is in such a way that we're not talking about necessarily the way that it appears, the way that it seems, the way that we love it or desire it, the way that we see it or taste it, touch it, or smell it. Is there a way in which we could talk about the world in which we find ourselves just as it is? Not as tasteful or visible, but just as it is. That's the branch of metaphysics. Now, as I said, way back in the origin of philosophy in the West, philosophers like Aristotle and Plato did not make a distinction between those questions of what things are, what the world is in itself, separate from how do we know it, what is our sense information telling us in relation to what the world is, and so on. They thought all of this was just philosophy. And by the way, most of them thought that those questions, let's say metaphysical questions, are actually in pursuit of the major question of philosophy, namely, how do we all together in common live or at least pursue a good life? Strangely, Plato and Aristotle tell a story about philosophy in the Western world that begins in Greece, well, among Greek-speaking peoples, and they say that the first philosopher is someone named Thales. We have no writings from Thales. We don't really have reports from people who knew him. We just have testimony of philosophers saying what they've heard generations later. And Aristotle tells us that Thales, this first philosopher, was supposed to have said something like, all things are water. Or maybe he said all things are from water. Aristotle says, the principle of all things is water, but probably he didn't say that, and I'll come back to that in just 1 second. But think about this for a moment. So here's this guy. Aristotle is claiming he is a philosopher. He's the first philosopher. And what does he say? He says, if you look out at the world, you see a tree, that's water. You see a house, that's water. You see grass, that's water. You see a bee, that's water. Now that sounds really stupid. Unless we go back to this insight that we seem to have, namely that the world isn't really as it appears to be. And so when Thales says that all things are water, or all things are from water, he seems to be indicating that there is a reality of the world in which we find ourselves that is not the reality that's presented to our senses, but somehow it's a reality behind or underlying or out there that we can get at in some other way. As I often say to students, Thales here pulls the face of things away to get at what they are behind the face they're showing. Now, this is an amazing move that Thales makes. In saying that all things are water or all things are from water, Thales is insisting we have to have access to the world outside of the way it appears to us, the way we desire it to be, the way we sense it to be, and so on. And that is a fundamentally metaphysical gesture in the way that I understand metaphysics. Now, why is it then that I'm interested? Because I clearly don't think all things are water. I don't think anyone today in the 21st century could claim that all things are water or even from water. So why is it that I'm interested in metaphysics? Well, I'm interested in this understanding that the world as it presents itself to us is not the world as it is. Now, I said earlier that this is not divorced from, for example, questions about what it means to be good or what the good and good life is about. That is, these questions can't be divorced from ethics. And here, I think, if we realize that the world often presents itself to us not in the way it really is, but in a different way, once we understand that, we can try to understand how the world as it appears to us is constructed, how it is presented, how it is made to appear by structures, forces, and so on that are independent of the world that appears to us. I think about something like race. If we do biology, biologists will tell us that there is nothing biologically that we can find and mark and say, oh yeah, that's race. So if something like race appears to us, and if I take Thales' insight that the face of reality is not necessarily the reality itself, I can now pull that face off and try to understand the ways in which what is now appears to me as this thing that we call race. So I think that questions about living the good life, and particularly living the good life in common, demand that we engage this impulse that I would say is what we call in philosophy metaphysics. I have been incredibly influenced by the philosopher Theodor Adorno. For those of you who aren't German speakers, it would look like Theodor Adorno. He comes from a way of thinking that is often referred to as critical theory, and that's because he himself was really interested in this impulse to take the face off of what appears to us and figure out how it has been made to appear to us in the way that it does. For him, the reason why this impulse of metaphysics is really important is because we need, he argues, to not accept what is given to us as the world as the only possibility. we have to try to understand that there is another possibility. There is an otherwise that is not just the world as it's presented to us. And that insight that we do not have to, and in fact, probably we must not accept the world as it is presented to us on its face, that critical impulse is the reason why studying metaphysics and taking a metaphysical approach to the world and to philosophy in general is crucial, and I will insist on it with my last living breath. While I have your attention, let me just give one more appeal that you join us in the community of this podcast by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at whatever level you feel comfortable. And seriously, I mean it. If it's $1 a month, it matters. You could become one of the regulars of our podcast. You could join our conversation, and you could do a tremendous amount to support us in the infrastructure that is necessary to keep us operating. All right, I'm so excited about the next season. We're working on it hard, and we have a lot of good topics coming up and some great guests. And so I will see you all in season 14.